So thank you all very much for joining us after our summer break. And we are very lucky to have with us the co-founder of the FASD Advocacy and Support Group, Red Shoes Rocks. And we have J Formanek, one of the great advocates of FASD in the community and mentor to many of the young voices that we see on our own webinars and on actions around the world. So RJ, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Lovely to have you.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. As a matter of fact, are you looking to highlight as a PR person? Because I could use that sometime.
But it's lovely to have you join us tonight. And can I just start by saying one of the things that we had today, we had a support group tonight. We have our FASD friendship group, and they're young FASD individuals that from the age of 11 through to 17, hosted by somebody you know very well, Maggie May, a good friend of the charity as well, and to this webinar series. And we asked quite a few of the people on that group what sort of questions they would like to ask you tonight as well. And we also had the FASD Awareness support group where we have parents and carers, and we asked them the same questions, because I think it's really important that, I can put forward my questions, but I think it's really important those that are living the life of FASD should have their voice as well and let that be heard and ask you the questions, because you are so eloquent and well known in the FASD community. So first of all, one of the questions that came up was, you got a diagnosis quite late in life, didn't you? What age were you when you got your diagnosis of FASD?
I had reached the ripe old age of 47. And this was after a lifetime of having a lot of questions, being the odd kid out, the odd man out. I had no idea. And eventually getting the diagnosis at the age of 47 started to make a whole lot of sense to all of the questions I'd had about myself all through growing up. So that was, a bit late.
Well, and that leads me exactly to one of the questions that the younger group were asking. And they were, what were those questions that you had? What were the things that you noticed that were different about you, that it made sense at 46, 47?
Well, I've always been a loner, and it hasn't been a lonely existence because I enjoy being alone. But I had noticed when I was younger that other kids would get jokes that I didn't understand. They'd be talking above my age limit, so I would tend to then gravitate towards hanging around with younger kids. And of course, growing up like that, you notice that you're definitely a little bit different. In school, I was always sort of singled out because of my behavior. I have ADHD, so if my hands are flying all over the place, that comes naturally. But when it manifests in school, you're the kid that can't sit down. You're the one who's the class clown, always acting out. Well, that was me. So my whole school experience was rather disrupted. Trying to keep a job, my executive functioning is fairly good, but I have a hard time with time, which is very common with people with FASD. And in fact, I found I was always showing up late for work. I'd be 5 minutes late, 10 minutes late. What I eventually started doing was getting up 2 hours early before I had to be ready to be somewhere. Now, the key there was it takes that long for my brain to start operating. And these are things I had figured out before my diagnosis. So I knew that I was operating differently than the people around me, but I couldn't explain why. Once I got the diagnosis, that started to make a whole lot more sense.
Absolutely. So you were already working out your own resources and strategies that worked for you before you knew and understood your diagnosis. Absolutely. Makes so much sense. Can we go back a bit? Because we're all intrigued, I'm sure, as to what was your early life like? What was the origins of your life, if you like? Tell us a little bit about that history.
Oh, it's a tale of woe. I was actually born to an unwed teen mother, and she gave me up at birth. Now, the twist to the story that actually makes it not that bad was the woman who took me was my grandmother. So I was still raised within my own family, but by my grandmother instead of my actual mother. Um, she never really had the capabilities to raise children very well. And it wasn't because of FASD in her case, it was more trauma related outside the home. And that can manifest in a lot of ways, which I have to bear to this day. However, being raised by my grandparents and having FASD, which of course was not diagnosed, I started getting into trouble. And then what we call children's aid stepped in, and I was removed from my grandparents and put into the foster care system. So I banged around there. I think I went through 13 foster homes or placements in 12 months.
Wow. And
because
what
I
age was
just
that?
didn't fit. Pardon me?
What age was that?
Um, that was when I was between 14 and 15.
Okay.
And that was also around the time that I quit school. Uh, what I did was I joined a band. I'm not a musician. I can count. And so they stuck me behind a drum kit. And that's where I was able to sort of hide, try to make a little money, and have a lot of fun. But fast forward a little bit to, I told you I quit school. Then I took a 5-year hiatus. This is when I was on the road and working with different bands and things like that. And then I decided that I had to sort of grow up, and I went to college. I took broadcasting. I ended up working in television news for 20 years. And that's where I really knew how different I was. Because in the television industry, if you're creative, you can get away with a lot as far as emotion and getting angry and outburst, as long as you put out great product. And fortunately, I was a good news photographer. I later became a video journalist. So these were skills I was building up, but all the time, I wasn't fitting in with the reporters. I fit in more with the technical guys. It was kind of a strange amalgamation.
And it's fascinating that you should mention about the creativity, because actually, you know, this is something, a trait that we see a lot in individuals with FASD, isn't it? I mean, you must have come across that yourself.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm sure you have too, being as musically inclined as you are. You've probably met a lot of people who are on the spectrum and you don't know it because we think differently. What it is our brains process the world. We see the world in a different way, which means we can express ourselves. We can see goals and ideas that maybe a neurotypical person doesn't. So neurodiversity is not a bad thing. It's a thing that once you know what you're working with, that's the key.
For many years, I've been an advocate of disabilities within the music industry. And it all stemmed really from one of my first foster children, who a way of communicating with them was through music. And I taught them how to play the bass guitar. And then all of a sudden they worked in a band, and we had this autism band. And it was one of the most phenomenal experiences I ever had. I've had the privilege of playing with some of the greatest musicians on the planet. And yet this group filled me with utter joy. They would never perform in public. We knew this from the outset. However, the creativity in that room at that time was phenomenal. And that opened my eyes, opened my minds to just what the creative mind was capable of on so many levels, and how society cuts out certain free thinking people that have learning difficulties.
Definitely, definitely. And it's a challenge with something like FASD, where People assume it's a brain thing. And yeah, definitely that's how we're often identified as how our brains work. But there are 428 comorbidities with FASD,
Mm.
other health conditions that go with it. And that can range, from heart and CNS problems, um, problems with your intestines and things like that. A lot of physical things, and there's a lot of mental health issues that can quite often come with it because if it's not known, if it's not identified, you can't put in the right supports, and that can often lead to people being supported in the wrong way.
Mm.
And that can be very dangerous. But it sounds like you've had some great experiences, and like you said, um, we're abstract thinkers, and that doesn't always have to be a negative thing when it's channeled into the proper areas. Now, proper area for me might be sitting here talking to you. For somebody else, it might be playing an instrument. For somebody else, it might be writing. So our individual talents can lead us in that way, but we have to be open to think differently and accept the fact that someone on the spectrum like myself sees the world in a different way.
And it's always very important to find somebody that can mentor that person as well, because we all have a mentor that has believed in us, given us that opportunity to be able to find their goal, find their journey. Did you have an individual mentor that helped you with that?
Oh, definitely. I had in my later teens and early 20s, before I went back to college, I had been placed in this foster home and then I aged out at age 18.
Mm.
But the woman there believed in me and she would tell me. And she bought me my first blazer when I went away to high school. So she was the support that I couldn't find anywhere else. And sometimes it only takes one person to be there at the right time and help you develop your own self confidence.
Mm.
Um, with FASD, my own experience, again, not being diagnosed, but my experience through life was I was always wrong. Like in algebra, you can get the same answer by figuring out a different way. So the class would be taught to do it a certain way, and I would do it in another. I'd still get the answer, but it was in a totally roundabout and wrong way. So that's the sort of thing. There was a lot of negative stuff growing up, and it really affected my self confidence. When I worked in television, I still didn't speak too much because I wasn't confident about that, but I was confident in my photography and my videography, my editing skills, and that helped me so much. So if you have someone who has a certain talent and they want to push and go forward with it, I say definitely support them, help them be there when they start to falter, and they'll show you like there's no limit to what we can do.
Absolutely. And we had in our support group this morning a family, several families that when we were asking the questions, there was one question that really struck a chord with me. And it was, if you had the opportunity and the mind that you have now to be able to say, I wish my carers could have done this for me or could have supported me better with this. If there was one thing, what would you say that was? Because everyone's looking for the answers to be able to support those individuals that are in our care or um, that
Well,
we live with.
I absolutely have to go back to what I was just saying, having someone believe in me. One of the things that happened when I went into the foster care system was these were paired carers. So they didn't believe in me. I was just some kid that blew in the door one day, and when they had enough, they shipped me out again. But that having someone believe in me was the thing that I could have used a lot more, especially earlier on. I think I might have actually become an actor because that was something I really wanted to do, but I didn't have the self-confidence. I didn't have the support. And it's pretty easy to, just go and get a job as a plumber. So,
And how did the behaviors that you had when you were at school, before you came out of school, what were those behaviors? What did they look like for you in school?
well, it's a little embarrassing to say right now, but from a very early age, I liked the girls. And I was always doing my best to impress the girls and things like that. I wasn't extremely into sport or anything so much, except for hockey. Of course, I am Canadian, and I definitely played hockey. But I sort of tried to be the cute one, the one that the girls liked, and that became more or less my focus. Like going to school was just a way to hang out with the girls, kind of thing. So it was kind of strange. And that started, like I said, very early. Um, it wasn't so much that I really don't know how to explain it. I think I felt challenged by other boys in a way that the girls didn't necessarily challenge me. So I'm not the biggest guy. I would get bullied and beat up. And I think that was just sort of a reaction to that.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. And so when you came into the industry that you found a home and you felt very comfortable. When did you first discover that? When did you discover the photography side? Who gave you that opportunity?
Oh, I got my first camera when I was about 7, and I was always playing with them after that. So it was just a natural thing for me to try and follow that. So when it came time to go to college, well, I didn't think I would be able to, put in 5 years to become a photographer, but I thought I could do video at least.
Mm.
And in my mind, like I said, I was always interested in movies, in television, in telling stories. So for me, it was just natural to follow that sort of instinct. And I'm extremely visual, um, hyper vigilant. When I was spent a little time in the armed forces, I did recon, which is sniper. So it's because I'm a very visual person. So something that was visual for me was one of the few things that was easy and I could understand. I can see light. I can understand how shadows fall. Depth of field is a natural thing for me. It's all very technical, but for me, it came so naturally.
Mm. And I'm really interested about the armed forces as well, because when for somebody that has FASD, to have the restrictions imposed upon them that, a lot of people struggle with with schooling because of the regime, if you like, the strict order, the processes, and that really they struggle with that. A lot of our children really
Oh,
struggle with that. Going into the armed forces, I would imagine, is even tougher. Can you tell us a little bit
exactly.
about your story there?
Well, I had been in Sea Cadets. I don't know. I think you might have Naval Cadets,
Yeah.
because, yeah, it was that sort of thing. And I grew up in that. And I did love the direction and the discipline, except a few times when I got in trouble. And I was actually very successful in that sort of situation. Then I decided to join the armed forces, and here where Canadian forces are all one. So I chose land forces as opposed to maritime. And I went through basic training, and then started going into advanced training for recon, like I was talking about. And a medical issue popped up that we found that I had a heart murmur, which precluded me from doing recon. So I was given the opportunity to leave. And, in retrospect, I think taking the medical out was probably the best thing for me because I would have spent a lot of time in the brig. I have no doubt about that.
Mm. Why?
Um, because I have, and I've spent years trying to learn how to work with this. I can, my emotions can easily, I can become overwhelmed, and a lot of times the easiest way to keep people away from you is to yell at them or something and to say, just shut up. And so that would not work in the armed forces. And I had more than a few times that I was on like overnight guard duty and things like that because of choices I had made, which often revolved around my temper.
Can I come in on that actually? Because this is something that we work with a lot of families and we work with a lot of individuals, because understanding how your moods are developing and what triggers that you have that build up and how you respond to those. I'm really interested in your own personal experiences, because you have so many coping mechanisms. You'd already created all these coping mechanisms for you before you even got a diagnosis. So you're a perfect person to talk to about this, because you'd already analyzed your behaviors and how you responded to people. You know, when you were talking earlier about how you already found that working with girls and approaching girls, it was a coping mechanism as well for you, I'm sure. So tell us a little bit about what sort of things triggered you, and also how did you see your anger building, and what coping mechanisms would you put in place there?
Okay, initially, and this would happen, excuse me. Initially, what I noticed, and this started happening really early, false accusations where I can't prove I didn't do something, kind of thing. And what I noticed, and this is part of how I began to notice I was different, was people would take advantage of my gullibility, and I would end up taking the blame for something I didn't do. And that was really frustrating. What was doubly frustrating was I couldn't prove I didn't do this said thing. So I was automatically blamed for a lot of things I didn't do. That could drive me, especially in my teens and early adults. Anything that involved a false accusation would automatically, I would go completely off the other end of the scale. Um, it's a very painful thing to be judged in that way, and that was like a trauma that I was carrying forward. And through the years, I've started to recognize when I'm getting to that point and that, what I can do for myself. Now, as I like to say, I now have my words, and I didn't have a way to explain in my earlier years and through my entire adult growing up, like I said, until my diagnosis. And then afterwards, I didn't have a way to explain, even to myself,
Mm.
why I did these things. And if you don't understand yourself, it's hard to trust yourself, and it's even harder to love yourself. So all of these things had to fall into place. And part of that started with developing strategies to not get in trouble. My first key, most important thing, and this lasts with me today, wherever I am, I have to know a way to get out. If I don't know how to get out of the building, that's when my stress will build up. But as soon as I know I have an exit strategy, and I walked when I was a kid, I ran, I rode my bike, I just got away on my own where I could process things. It takes me a little while to figure things out. And sometimes in a heated situation, say it's emotional or something, I found it was best for me to remove myself, do my processing, and then come back. So that was one of the first things that I learned, because in the moment, this mouth can go and go and go. And a lot of the damage that can be done that way is, you can't change that. So that was something I had to learn.
That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. So let's move on through your life now. So we've gone into the workplace. You're in the workplace. You've found a niche that you're really very good at, and people are admiring and enjoying the qualities of your work. You're also at the same time managing behaviors and identifying behaviors. Where did that lead you? What was the next stage in your life?
Well, I had gotten married and then I got divorced, and that would happen right during my, I guess you call it a midlife crisis, when I was about 40. So, yeah, I worked for a national broadcaster and I quit my job, moved to Europe for 6 months, worked in Prague doing this and that for 6 months, came back to Canada, worked for a local cable station for about 5 years. And when the divorce came, I quit. Excuse me. When I got my divorce, I quit television and I became a long distance truck driver. So
That's a,
I
that's a pretty
completely,
lonely existence, isn't it? Your perfect job in a way, I would imagine.
that was exactly what I wanted, was just to be by myself.
Yeah.
I felt that the world had turned on me and that, I was just feeling really beaten down and I wanted to do something. Obviously, I had to have a job, but it had to be something where I didn't have to deal with a lot of people. Wasn't quite the job for me, but I did that for 2 years, I think, almost 2 years. So it was after I got injured on that job that I got my diagnosis through a friend of mine who kept saying to me that my freakouts, the way I was and everything, well, that it might be fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which I had never really heard of at the time. I
Mm.
didn't believe it that there was such a thing, and it took between 5 and 7 years to get my diagnosis from when we first started the process. Now, this was very, very early, and I was already, like I said, 47 years old. So finding old school records and things like that, that takes a while. But you have to build up this profile through the life to prove um, that the diagnosis. So all of that took years and years, and I ended up being the first adult diagnosed in this part of Ontario.
Wow. And how did you get the diagnosis? Because I mean, in this country, we're trying to make strides with diagnosis, but it's so rare for adults to be diagnosed. So how did you find did you find a doctor that understood? What was your how did you manage it?
Well, I will be frank. At that point in my life, I was looking for a way not to be here anymore.
Right.
And I actually ended up, against my will, being placed in a hospital because people thought I was a danger to myself. And potentially, I may very well have been. I don't know. I was really drunk at the time.
Mm.
But I was then given a psychiatrist, and he went through my records and he kept saying that, this kind of fits, this doesn't fit, this, and we tried different medications and everything like that. We have a diagnostic clinic here in Thunder Bay, and even then it was an amazing thing to have one.
Mm.
But in this part of Ontario, we're the largest, the only major city. We're like 200,000 and we're considered a large city here. So the diagnostics were here for children.
Yes.
And I approached them, and luckily, the diagnostician decided to try. And like I said, it took a few years and a lot of work on her part. I am amazed at the things that she found in my past that I had no idea about,
Mm.
but we were eventually able to get the diagnosis. And
And
up and Actually, up until I got the diagnosis, I didn't read about FASD. I didn't know a thing about it because I have had so many diagnoses that have been changed, canceled over the years that I no longer had any faith in the medical or mental health system.
Can you tell us about the different diagnoses that you'd been given that were changed then?
Oh boy, reactive attachment disorder. I was diagnosed with failure to thrive very early on. I had my first operation was on my lower intestine when I was 2 weeks old. That was not a mental health diagnosis. Um, then I've been diagnosed with what they were calling at the time major depression. They looked at me for psychoses such as schizophrenia. Um, they looked at me a lot for what was known as manic depression at the time. And different psychologists and psychiatrists, because I've been seeing them all the time. Everybody knew I was a troubled child. Um, do you have ACEs?
Yes, absolutely.
Adverse childhood
Yeah.
experiences? There are, I believe,
Traumas. Yeah. Mm.
10 on the list. I had been through 9 of them. So I
Wow.
was identified as, probably a potentially damaged kid. And I was able to navigate my way through the mental health system. So I got a lot of these different diagnoses that almost fit, and they would try the meds or try the therapy for it, and then it wouldn't work because it wasn't a mental health thing. It was my brain works differently.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
And once that was recognized,
yes.
I was able to drop all of these, as I like to call them, BS diagnoses, because they were only working with limited information. They didn't know my brain is actually physically made differently, so it works differently.
And we spoke earlier about stigmas, didn't we? Before we came on, and actually, a lot of that list that you mentioned there, it must have thrown you into complete questioning of, well, what's going on inside my brain? I have no idea because I'm being given all this array. I'm confused enough in my own mind what's going on. So you needed this eureka moment. You needed some sort of somewhere to go. Thank God you are still around, because when you go through a moment of revelation, if you like, where you make choices that can go one way or the other, and
Mhm.
just by luck, just by chance, by serendipity, if you like, that journey took you down that other path, and here you are today advocating for FASD. So can you tell us what that looked like when you got that diagnosis and you started reading up and understanding more about the condition?
Well, I had, like you're calling it, literally a eureka moment. Up until after I got my diagnosis, I hadn't even researched it. So I went online and started looking, and the internet was still pretty rough back in those days. But everything that I was seeing was extremely negative. And then a friend of mine lent me a book by a lovely lady named Bonnie Buxton. Now, the book was called Damaged Angels. And what it was she had chronicled her life with her daughter, Colette. And as I read the book, I identified with Colette. Absolutely. Finally, she was doing the things in the same way I was. So I knew at that point that I was definitely on to something. So yeah, Bonnie Buxton's book changed my life for me, because then I started looking for the positives. And like I said, what I was seeing online was a whole lot of negative stuff. I ended up joining a listserv and writing furiously that a lot of these stigmas and ideas they have might not be correct. And that sort of evolved into a Facebook group, Flying with Broken Wings, where we now have pretty close to 7,000 members. And the thing that works with the group, we have caregivers, we have professionals, we have people on the spectrum. And the thing that I'm most proud about is it's the people on the spectrum who are running the group.
Mm.
This is our group. This is where we can go to, it's a secure group. We can go there. We can talk freely about what it's like to live with FASD. And for many people, they've never talked to someone with it. They've never met someone with it. And you feel really, really alone. And we don't want people to feel alone in that way. So it's very important that getting out, advocating, saying, yes, we deal with a lot, but you know what? We have a spirit that, is above all of that. You meet people with FASD, you're going to meet some of the most charming, most stimulating people you'll ever meet in your life, because that's the way their brains work. And I love meeting people with FASD, seeing how other people experience the spectrum, because we are all very, very different.
Absolutely. I'm going to just talk to the attendees as well that you're very welcome to use the Q&A facility on here. Please do. If you've got any questions that you want to ask, try not to make them too personal, because I will vet them anyhow and ask RJ the questions. But one of the questions we did have on here is, did you ever have any brain structure investigations to determine if your brain was abnormal in structure at all?
Well, we know that prenatal alcohol does change the structure of the brain. I myself have not been able to get what I want is a functional MRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, which can actually show how the brain is working. An MRI doesn't really show it very well, but I would love to be able to just see how my brain is actually working. That'd be fantastic.
Absolutely. And how different triggers might respond in different places, and see how that would work. I think that would be a fascinating subject. So can we look at the amazing Red Shoes Rock? You've had FASD Awareness Month. It's probably the busiest time of year for you. Can you tell us what that's looked like for you this year?
Well, this year has been really interesting because I kind of I've had some other issues to deal with, so I kind of taken a back seat. And for me, seeing what people all around the world are doing to mark International FASD Day on September 9th and the entire month, it just, it's amazing. Red shoes, the reason I wore them was because I wanted to be able to signify to someone else that I'm different. So I would wear a suit with the red shoes, and a certain Doctor Who character, the 10th one, actually picked up on that, I think, and he stole my red shoes.
Excellent.
Anyways, for me, it was just a personal statement. One of the things was I could never get a pair of red running shoes when I was a kid. They were black and white, and I didn't have any. Like I said, I was an acaricist, and it was something I always wanted. So as an adult, I was able to, and I said, why not? Because it just represents mobility, thinking differently. And for me, like I said, I would run when I was a kid. So for me, it represents freedom and knowing my way out.
Absolutely.
And I met this woman, Jody Culp, and she saw that might be something that we might be able to use as a rallying point. At that point, there was not really an FASD color or flag or anything like that. There were a few competing ones with ribbons and things, but nothing to sort of bring people together. And most people wear shoes. So that's a place that, Jody figured we could start. And watching it spread around the world and people taking it as their own. We have a website, Red Shoes Rocks FASD Aware. And people can come there and take any of our graphics and any of the stuff that we've made up, and they can use it themselves to help them further and tell their own stories. And it's just amazing.
I've got a lovely question here that I'm going to ask, if I may. It says, how was it coming to terms with your diagnosis? Was it helped by your own intuitive curiosity up to that point in your life?
Yes, yes. At that point, there weren't any support services. There were no groups to join. In fact, I asked the diagnostician, okay, what's the next step? And she says, well, have a good life, because that's basically it. There were no support. So I had to rely on my own resources. And this is, again, why it's so important that we get the word out about FASD and let people know that they're not broken. They're just different. So
we've all met so many fascinating characters within the FASD community, and you tapped in on quite a few of the great qualities. What would you say, in your experience of connecting with so many people in the FASD community, what is their superpower, if you like? That's the question. What is their superpower do you recognize linked with FASD?
this is going to sound really trite, but I think it's love. Um, People with FASD often suffer from lack of it, but when they are able to be given the opportunity to express, I have seen people showing love of their their brother in ways that I don't see with a lot of other groups. Um, the superpower is, I think, a belief that there is something better and that we can find it one day. There's a hopefulness, almost, and I'm a little reticent to use this, but almost a childlike quality in that belief. And this is where people get hurt, is when
Trust.
that is abused. Yes, that trust. But
Mm.
once you've got the trust of a person with FASD, just sit back and watch them. They're going to fly,
Mm.
because that's what they need, a little trust, and someone who can say, I believe in you.
This leads to relationships. You mentioned about your own relationship, and so many relationships fail for whatever reason. But can you tell us about, you don't have to go into your own experience of your marriage, but about relationships, because of that vulnerability that you mentioned as a child, you were susceptible to wanting to impress. You would probably take on more ideas and suggestions than maybe you should have. And I think frequently you became the butt because of that. So when you look at a relationship, you question that trust. You want to trust that. What happens when you find people that you do trust?
Oh, that one is difficult, because I've known a lot of women, and I've been burned a lot of times. But relationships are very tricky, because until I understood myself and forgave myself for my own inadequacies, I could not communicate with my partner in a way that, like they would always say, they could get so close to me and then there was a wall. And I could not change that, because, through life, through trauma, through all of the things we experience, we build up these defenses. And sometimes we're not even aware that they're in play at the time. And this was constantly destroying relationships,
Mm.
because part of the way FASD manifests with me is what is known as a flat effect. My face, my reactions sometimes are very, very minimal. So, you could have a bomb blow up in front of me and I'll remain completely placid on the outside. Doesn't take into account what's really going on the inside. But like I like to tell people, I forget to use my face sometimes. Sometimes I forget to smile. So these are things that come naturally to other people. It's not in my wheelhouse. That's something I have to actively do as a communication effort for the people around me. So if you're in a relationship with someone who can't open up, it's frustrating for you. It's even more frustrating for them, and not understanding why you can't open up. And you end up with a lot of sadness. You see great people who have to go away because it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
So one of the things, and I can understand why parents might want to do this, but I strongly caution them, is assuming that if you have a teenage son with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and Joe down the street has a teenage daughter, that they're going to get along and, can become sort of a couple. I really suggest that's probably not a good idea. That maybe dating someone else with the same disorder might be asking for a lot of trouble. I'm sure some people can do it, and I've seen people do it, but it takes a lot of work.
The point there that you mentioned was understanding yourself, because if once you understand your condition, and if you have the ability to be reflective as well and be able to understand that and therefore communicate it. This is something that we try and work with a lot of our families, because parenting somebody with FASD, you have to change the way you parent.
Mhm.
What advice would you give to parents in parenting a child with FASD?
First off, I would say if you're in a group like this one, that's the first step, is find other people who are dealing with what you're dealing with. So finding these groups is really good because you can share information and ideas. Now, as far as working with the child, it's, you don't want to tell them lies and tell them that nothing's wrong, but you don't want to go over the other way either. So, raising a child to understand that, yes, they're different than that one, that child, or that child, or that child, but then that child, that child, and that child are all different, anyways. So, getting them to accept that we don't have to buy into the everyone does the same thing, wears the same clothes, the little boxes type theory. And yeah, a lot of times you're going to be shaking your head. You're not going to understand why they're doing what they're doing, but they're doing it because they're different. And that's a challenge for parents. But just remember that this is the kid that you've been raising, and that if you can trust them and let them know that you trust them, they're going to want to keep earning that trust. So it's really one hand washes the other very, very much. How you deal with a child with FASD is going to be totally different than how you would deal with a neurotypical child. Absolutely. And
And
it starts with the child. Absolutely. Talking to, not talking at. When I was a child, my only self-image was what I was told I was. I didn't actually develop my own self-image until I was in my mid-20s. Up until that point, I let other people describe me, and that's who I became. When I was a teenager, they said, you're a hooligan, you're a hoodlum. I became a hooligan and a hoodlum because I could not see myself. And that's the thing. Being a concrete thinker, it's hard for me to see myself through your eyes, kind of thing. And that's so different for me. So again, understanding that maybe the child doesn't understand your point of view. because they honestly think differently.
Absolutely. And you picked up on it there, and it's something that we advocate so much with families, is that put the child in the center of the conversation. Get them to be involved in thinking, analyzing, planning, understanding, come to an agreement on how to move forward from something, rather than everything be negative. Look at the positives, get them involved in that conversation. I had a lovely question that I wanted to put to you as well before we bring it to a close. The mature you with a diagnosis, with your experience and your knowledge, what would you say to the young person, that hoodlum that you were referring to a few minutes ago? What would you say to the young RJ?
Take your time. You don't have to grow up in a day or a year. Be who you need to be, and don't worry about other people's expectations. Yes, you have to fit into societal norms to keep a job and do those things, but be true to yourself. If you love to read, read everything. Continue learning from day to day, year to year, and this, will take you as far as you want to go.
You've been a mentor to so many through your Facebook groups, and you've individually mentored many of the great voices in the FASD community. Can you tell us about the pleasure that's brought you?
It is, I love watching people who initially show up. They have a lot of ideas, but don't know how to put those ideas into action. And watching younger people on the spectrum accept what FASD is, what their version of FASD is, and build on both their strengths and their vulnerabilities. And it's incredible to watch them grow. And, this year especially, we are seeing so many younger people speaking up and speaking out. And I know you have one with you, Maggie May, who is someone that I have, spent some time chatting with and talking to over the years. And she is like a rising star. And it's incredible to watch. It makes me so proud to see these people accepting and then sharing their own stories. It's great.
And thank you so much for sharing your story with us tonight. Thank you for your frankness and honesty. And it's through that the words get out to the wider community, people that need to understand what fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is and what it looks like, what it is to live with the condition, and where we can move forward to understand better and set up the right resources, set up the right management plans to scaffold individuals from a young, early age to be able to then develop and help them become the best of them, the best life that they can live that leads to better outcomes. So thank you, RJ, so much for your time tonight. I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. And I would like to thank everybody for joining us and trying to get as many insights as you can get. So thank you all for joining us. I wish you all the very best. I hope to see you next month. Once again, RJ, have a lovely night. Thank you for joining us. All the very best.
Thank you.
Good night.